Now, as we do so many weeks here at the Daily Dose, we need to get to our Daily Dose top 5. Super Bowl 57 is now set. The Philadelphia Eagles will be facing the Kansas City Chiefs in Arizona, and we are going to have a battle of some pretty young quarterbacks. Think about this. Eagles quarterback Jalen Hurts, he will be 24 years and 189 days old on Super Bowl Sunday. Kansas City Chiefs quarterback Patrick Mahomes will be 27 years old and 148 days. A little bit older. But something I want you to think about today. Who are the youngest quarterbacks to have ever started in Super Bowl history? And while you're thinking about that, I'm going to give you one additional kind of little trivia question. Who is the youngest player to have ever taken a snap at quarterback in a Super Bowl? Not necessarily the starter, but the youngest player to take a snap. But today, our Daily Dose Top 5 is counting down the youngest starting quarterbacks ever in Super Bowl history. We start off at number 5, and we have a very familiar face because it was just back in 2020 that the Kansas City Chiefs went to Super Bowl 54, where they managed to beat the San Francisco 49ers 31-20. Chiefs quarterback Patrick Mahomes was given the Super Bowl Most Valuable Player award as Kansas City won their first title in 50 years. Now, for the game, Mahomes threw for 286 yards, he had 2 touchdowns, and he, outdueled 49ers quarterback Jimmy Garoppolo. Hey, that's pretty impressive stuff. Granted, Garoppolo didn't, do a ton in that game. He made a few big errors. But still, when you think about that, Patrick Mahomes in Super Bowl 54, he was only 24 years old and 144 days. That's a young guy. Mahomes won the Super Bowl and won the MVP at that very young age. 24 years and 144 days come in today on our list of youngest Super Bowl starting quarterbacks at number 5. We move on to number 4, and we arrive at a quarterback that actually started the Super Bowl 1 year prior to Mahomes. This was back in Super Bowl 53. You might remember that game because Tom Brady and the New England Patriots would be facing the Los Angeles Rams in what ended up to be a very boring game. It ended with a 13-3 Patriot win. It wasn't very fun to watch. But the Rams just couldn't generate much offense all day. Now, some of that was because they faced a pretty stout Patriot defense designed by Patriot head coach Bill Belichick. And then some of it was also young Rams quarterback Jared Goff. I mean, he played okay. But think about this. Jared Goff on that day was 24 years old and 121 days on that Super Bowl Sunday. So in the game, Goff threw for 229 yards and an interception. He didn't have a touchdown. And the Rams, it just didn't ever feel like they were ever really a threat to mount enough scoring to beat the Patriots. Think about it. New England only scored 13 points. And that was plenty. They still won by double digits. So the Rams just couldn't mount any offense. And like I said, some of that was because they had a young quarterback. Jared Goff, at 24 years and 121 days old, comes in today at number 4. We land at number 3, and we go clear back to the year 1982 for this one. The NFL had a player strike that year that nearly canceled the entire season, but they brought the players back, and they actually managed to finish out the year. They played 9 total games, and then the playoffs just went on. So in those playoffs, the Miami Dolphins played in one of the greatest games that I have ever seen in history. They beat the San Diego Chargers at home in those NFL playoffs in a wild game in Miami. Then Miami went on to shut out the New York Jets, low-scoring game, and they advanced to Super Bowl 17, where the Miami Dolphins lost 27-17. to 17 to quarterback Joe Theismann, big rumbling fullback John Riggins, and the Washington Redskins. But you might think back to that game and be like, was that Dan Marino under center for the Dolphins? Who was that? No, it wasn't. The Dolphins actually had LSU quarterback David Woodley starting that season, and he played reasonably well for Miami that year. But unfortunately, in the big game, he had a very, very rough day. Washington had a tough defense, so it wasn't just Woodley. But they held David Woodley to just 97 passing yards all day. But I mean, David Woodley was just 24 years and 103 days old. What did we expect? David Woodley was a very young guy facing a very tough Washington team. He came up short. He didn't do so well, and he comes in today on our list at number 3. Next up, we get to number 2. And we go back to the 2005 NFL season where the Seattle Seahawks had gone to Super Bowl 40 behind quarterback Matt Hasselbeck. They would be facing the Pittsburgh Steelers with their young quarterback Ben Roethlisberger. And the Steelers would win a really, really strange game. That was one of the weirder Super Bowls that I can remember. A lot of questionable officiating calls. A lot of really weird penalties. And when you think about it, Ben Roethlisberger did not have a good game. He went just 9 of 21 for 123 yards. That's not much better than David Woodley did. He threw 0 touchdowns. He threw 2 interceptions. And yet, the Pittsburgh Steelers won that game basically with their very tough defense. And wide receiver Hines Ward, he made a few big plays. So Ben Roethlisberger got a Super Bowl ring at the age of just 23 years and 346 days, just shy of his 24th birthday. Granted, Big Ben didn't really do all that much to earn that Super Bowl ring, but hey, he got it. And he was the second youngest quarterback ever to start in a Super Bowl. Ben Roethlisberger comes in today at number 2. So we reach the number 1 youngest quarterback to ever start in a Super Bowl. But before we get to that, did you come up with who might have been the youngest player to ever take a snap at quarterback in the Super Bowl? A little bit tougher to come up with that one. You might have a couple of ideas. Was it a holder? Who would have taken a snap at quarterback? No, it was back in 1996 when 23-year-old Cordell Stewart took a few snaps at quarterback, back when he was in that slash role playing for the Pittsburgh Steelers facing the Dallas Cowboys in Super Bowl 30. Stewart actually didn't even attempt to pass, but he ran a few times as the quarterback, even though he wasn't the starter. He's not our number 1 entry. Neil O'Donnell was actually the starter for the Steelers that day, and we all know he played terrible. But Cordell Stewart is actually the youngest guy to ever take snaps as a quarterback in the Super Bowl. Now, we get to our number 1 entry, and we go back to 1984, where the San Francisco 49ers were rolling along. They hadn't quite turned into the massive dynasty they would be, but a lot of pieces were there. They had Joe Montana. They had Roger Craig. They had Dwight Clark. They had Freddie Solomon, and we know some other big pieces were coming. But San Francisco had a very underrated defense. And across from them, in Super Bowl 19, would be, once again, we've already talked about them today, the Miami Dolphins. And a second-year quarterback by the name of Daniel Constantine Marino Jr. Dan Marino had one of the most amazing seasons in NFL history in 1984. He threw for 48 touchdowns. That is a record that stood until 2013. That's insane. Remember, this wasn't the days of throw the ball all over the place. Not at all. You could hit him. You could hit his receivers. You could hit him in the legs. You could hit him high. You could hit him low. You could hit him after he got rid of the ball. You could land on him. You could try to hurt him. You could throw his receivers down. You could do whatever you wanted. And yet, somehow, Dan Marino didn't care. He was throwing touchdowns all over the place. 48 back then? That would be like throwing 68 now. That's absolutely insane. Unfortunately, the Super Bowl itself didn't go so well. In the big game, Marino did manage to throw for 318 yards. He had a touchdown, but the Dolphins were just outmatched. Joe Montana threw for 331 yards. He threw for 3 touchdowns. He didn't turn it over. He never did. And the Niners rolled to an easy 38-16 win. And that was that. Okay, but big deal. Dan Marino was just 23 years and 133 days old when he started that game. He was going to be back plenty of times, except that he never made it back again. Hey, in Super Bowl 57, we are going to be watching a couple of very young quarterbacks squaring off. And we can see from our list today, a lot of times those young quarterbacks, they don't always fare that well in the big game. It's a big game. It's a ton of attention. It's 2 weeks of talking about it and preparing for it and getting nervous. And a lot of times that doesn't work so well for those young guys. But as we also saw on our list today, you had better take advantage of the opportunity when you do get to that big game, because you never know if you're going to get back again. Hey, YouTube, make sure you go over and you check out the rest of the podcast. We're actually releasing some Daly Dose Power Rankings this week on the show. Talk some NBA, talk some college hoops. We even talk some NHL. And we are starting to take a look at the big game. Super Bowl 57 will be here soon. So be sure you go over and you check out the full podcast. I will leave a link here in the comments on YouTube for you. Hope you all are doing well. I will see you all next week. Have a great week.